Please welcome to the stage Andy Serwer, Editor-in-Chief, Yahoo Finance, and Rajiv Shah, President, the Rockefeller Foundation.
Thank you very much and welcome to this session, and let's welcome Dr. Raj Shah. It's great to see you, Raj, in person.
It's great to be with you in person.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time, and so it's great to be back doing these things real time and not virtually. We have this economic case for greening the global recovery as our topic today, but we also want to talk about not only climate change, but also poverty and COVID, of course. And it's sort of a big question and of a piece that those three scourges are really interconnected. And maybe you could sort of set the stage a little bit and talk about how they are connected.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Andy. And the reality is, right now we face this extraordinary potential divergence in the global economy. Since World War II, the story of fighting poverty and disease on a global basis has been one of convergence. Lower income countries grew faster than the rest of the world. We beat back HIV/AIDS, we beat back Ebola. We succeeded at bringing health and real improvements in living standards to the world's poorest people over decades. And COVID-19 is turning all of that around. Today, 500 million people have been pushed back under an expanded definition of the poverty line in lower income countries. You have immunization rates in Africa are under 4%. In Asia, they're creeping up, but still not anywhere near the levels you're seeing in OECD economies. And the result of that is many of us expect over the next decade that wealthy nations and wealthy populations will have the resources to fight COVID and recover quickly, and lesser developed countries will be stuck in a slower growth environment with greater disease and greater death. And that outcome, that huge divergence, is really consequential for the world. It means more poverty, more migration, less of an effort to come together and fight climate change, what we just heard about. And we really believe now is the moment for much bolder, much more transformational action to turn that around.
Yeah, that inequity, so in other words, it speaks to the inequity and exacerbates the inequity, those trends that we were just talking about. That's sobering. And I want to ask you about, say, just vaccinations for COVID, because less than 10% of the developing world is vaccinated. What can we do about that? And what are you guys at Rockefeller looking to do there?
Well, the reality is America has led at least a half dozen times major global efforts in the last 50 years to overcome big disease burdens: smallpox, polio, Ebola, now COVID-19. And we just need to do so much more to make vaccines available in lesser developed countries. We need to get beyond the sort of positive press release mindset and really do the types of things that invest in health workers all across the world so they can actually deliver vaccines and immunizations. As you point out, 10% is where we're at kind of globally in the lesser developed nations. We do need to be at 70% by the middle to end of next year in order to have real herd immunity for the world. And until we get there, we're going to have more variants. Those variants are going to undermine the US economy and the global economy, and we will never all be safe unless we deal with this as a global community. That's not happening right now, so the Rockefeller Foundation has committed $1 billion to a global green recovery. Our investments in health are part of that. We support testing, oxygen, vaccination, and other such efforts all around the world in order to give everybody a chance to get to 70%.
Is that part of your COVID charter program?
That is part of yes, absolutely. In fact, we've called for a COVID charter because we want people to see that the world is basically at war with a pathogen, COVID-19, that is harming billions of people. And the reality is, during wartime, we muster great resources to respond. And in America, for example, we have mustered great resources. In fact, by percentage of GDP, richer countries have spent 24% of GDP in stimulus actions to respond to the economic consequences of COVID-19. Lesser developed countries have spent 2%. And that's why you see this huge divergence. It's why we're at 10%. It's why those who are skeptical about the next decade are well grounded to be somewhat skeptical that we can get over this together.
But it can be a difficult political argument to make because it's essentially a foreign aid healthcare argument in the United States, which doesn't always play well. But the argument would be that their dollars well spent because otherwise the variants come back and cripple the economy at a greater rate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, if you look at lower income countries that have low vaccination rates are 4 times more likely to generate variants of concern that will undermine the economic recovery in wealthier countries. So making the investment, which is about $50 billion, 4 different people, including the Rockefeller Foundation, have said, what would it cost to achieve herd immunity all over the planet? The answer is about $50 billion. There's some debate about how much of that is for delivery and how much is for vaccine procurement. Right now, we're nowhere near having that $50 billion. We have maybe a quarter of that, maybe a third of that. So we need to raise those resources. We need to organize a proper global effort and campaign. We need to empower some of the alliances that have come together, including the COVAX alliance, to actually buy and distribute vaccines. And frankly, we have to help countries with everything from human resources to deliver vaccines to cold chain and ultra cold chain to be able to protect the sanctity and effectiveness of those vaccines. The one thing I'll say is we've done this before. I was pleased to be part of an effort in 1999-2000 when the world launched the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And at that time, about 40% of the world's kids were being immunized. Today, it's north of 70%. Because of a 20-year global effort. That's the kind of focus we need on COVID-19, but we need it to happen much, much faster.
One more question about COVID before we switch over to climate change a little bit. President Biden is holding a summit, I believe, on Wednesday that speaks to that 70% threshold that you just mentioned, Raj. And what do you hope to hear from the president the day after tomorrow?
Well, I have a tremendous amount of faith in President Biden's ability to marshal the global political energy to actually fight COVID in lower income countries. I think the first thing he has to do is sort of commit to 70%, set a deadline, get everybody to agree to that. The second thing is between the United States and other nations, we have to have the public funding to achieve that goal. And I think the president here and all of his counterparts around the world should make commitments to do so. The third component is the approach has to be public-private. I mean, part of our call for a COVID charter as the Rockefeller Foundation is a real belief that if you're going to solve these problems, you need public-private partnerships. And so we need manufacturers to make more vaccine doses available. We need countries to allow those doses, like India has to let Serum Institute sell those doses to other nations so that everyone has access to more volume. And we need to do that as a joint effort between governments and companies. And right now that jointness is not really happening the way it needs to.
Calling for that is music to the Concordia organizers' ears, because that's what they're all about, right? Climate change, the United Nations Climate Conference is upcoming, and you've talked about the need for electrification, but of course also to reduce a reduction in carbon emissions. How do you rectify those two goals?
Well, here's how. We just heard Secretary Kerry say that 55% of global GDP are in countries that have committed to holding climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. That means 45% are not part of that equation. Well, why are they not part of it? It's because they account for a small share of total emissions, about 20%. It's because they look and they say, well, why would we expend tremendous resources to solve a problem we haven't caused at a time when our priority is finding an on-ramp for human opportunity for our own people, jobs, upward economic mobility, real improvements in their living standards. And without a good answer to that question, I just simply don't think you get a global climate deal. So the answer the Rockefeller Foundation is proposing is bringing together a public-private partnership, that concept again, in a big global alliance to end energy poverty. There are 1 billion people that live without access to, one light bulb's worth of power for a whole year, which means you really can't do anything if you don't have access to any amount of basic electricity. And in the 63 countries that are energy poor, we now know that addressing energy poverty, giving people access to renewable electrification, can create 500 million jobs, 500 million jobs, real upward mobility, and frankly is the only real path to get countries interested in a serious energy transition on a global basis. So we're excited to be putting this partnership together and launching it at the COP this year in Glasgow. And we need all of you in the Concordia community to come join us. If you're an energy company or a technology company or a development agency or a government, this is really something we should all be doing together with urgency and focus.
Is this connected to the initiative that you announced at Concordia last year, and how so?
Absolutely. This is, in fact, an extension of successes that Rockefeller has invested in for almost 10 years on the ground. In India, for example, we partner with Tata Power to reach, our goal is to reach about 100 million people with, these are called rural mini-grids. They're solar installations with battery backup, with often AI-based remote battery management, energy management systems. But the bottom line is we're able to provide power at 20-some cents a kilowatt hour to people who either never had access to any real electricity or rely on diesel generators that are dirty, that are expensive, that are unsafe, and this is much, much cheaper and much more effective. And what we've seen in the almost 1 million people we serve through these types of projects is once people plug in, they grow. They grow their energy consumption, they grow their family's economic welfare, they grow their communities right out of poverty, and they do it using renewable power. And the world has a choice. If we can get these 63 nations to grow their future based on renewable energy instead of fossil fuels, we'll save 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. So while right now people don't look at these countries as having caused the problem, in fact, we're looking at a genuine solution that can create jobs, that can create opportunity for 1 billion plus people, and that can help us create a just and equitable recovery from this unique crisis we're in.
Where does China fit in when you talk about those countries? Which camp does it sit in? Which group is it in?
It sits in all of the camps. It's amazing. China is, of course, a huge part of the supply chain for photovoltaics and for energy storage solutions, especially for lower income and developing countries. At the same time, the Chinese Belt Road Initiative is currently financing about 112 gigawatts of new coal generation in 27 partner countries. That's really the wrong direction. And I'm encouraged by some recent Chinese statements that they want to green the BRI or green the Belt Road Initiative. One way to do it is invest massively with us and others to help bring renewable electrification to the world's poorest countries and communities. And really, let's use this crisis to sort of do the big, bold things we did after World War II, the Marshall Plan that lifted up Western Europe, the creation of the Bretton Woods Institution that maintained some degree of long-term economic stability. That's the mindset we should have, and that's why we've called for the COVID Charter, and it's why we're launching this alliance.
Raj, how would you assess the mindset of business leaders when it comes to the green economy? And initially the thought was this is sort of a charity work, and then it ultimately should become a profit center. Where are we in that continuum, do you think?
Well, I think in the energy space in particular, we've made the shift to profit center, right? It was sort of side project to now this is the future, and the question is how fast do we get there and who's going to win in that future? And we see that in our partnerships. I mean, when we partner with Tata, we have 30 other companies that approach us and say, okay, how did they do that? How do we work with you to make this real? And we know these things will be very profitable over time, which is why it makes sense to do as a public-private partnership. But I still think without real public leadership and investment and holding up their end of the bargain, it's still too hard for companies to just make these big leaps in infrastructure on their own when they're up against a fixed infrastructure of fossil fuel dependent economic reality.
All right, we are going to have to leave it at that. Please join me in thanking Dr. Raj Shah, President of the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you.